We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 21a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing a brisa which excluded both dam and eitzim from the requirement of melach, from the requirement of salt. But the Gemara asked on the previous Amud that brisa, it also refers to eitzim as a carbon, which means that brisa is following the opinion of Rebbe, because Rebbe holds that eitzim, if one donates wood, that's considered to be a carbon. But the problem is that Rebbe actually holds that the wood does require salting, and so therefore the brisa internally does not make any sense. And so the Gemara said actually you should take out eitzim, take out wood from that brisa. But the problem with that is that there were two exclusions in that brisa. There was one exclusion that excluded blood, and there was another exclusion that excluded the eitzim, that excluded the wood. And now the question is, what would we do with the two exclusions? Now we're only excluding blood. And so the Gemara now continues and says, Apik eitzim, take wood out of that brisa, va'ayil nisachim, and instead put in nisachim, put in libations. The libations are going to be excluded by the brisa, so there's no requirement of salt, no requirement of melach when it comes to nesachim. And the Gemara continues, Detanya, as we learned in a brisa, and Rashi explains, Detanya, yayin ein aton melach. This brisa is being brought to show that wine does not require salting, it does not require melach. Detanya, as we learned in a brisa, aval hayayin v'hadam v'ha'etzim v'ha'ketores, but the wine and the blood and the wood and the ketores, which is the incense, ein te'un and melach, they do not require salt. And the Gemara continues and asks, Moni, who's the author of the brisa? Rebbe, if the author of the brisa is Rebbe, so kasha eitzim, then we have a difficulty of wood, because again, according to Rebbe, wood actually does require melach. And Rabbanan, if we're going to say that this brisa is the Rabbanan, so then kasha ketores, then we have a difficulty from ketores. And Rashi explains, v'kaparach hashas, the Gemara asks, Moni hach brisa, who's the author of this brisa? Again, this brisa which is saying, aval hayayin v'adam v'eitzim v'ketores ein tu'unin melach, who's that brisa? Because we're going to have a difficulty if you're going to say it's the Rabbanan kasha ketores, then we have a difficulty with incense. This brisa is saying that incense does not require salt, but the problem is, deharavinon la'el, we included earlier, kol sha'acherim boin lochova, we included earlier anytime something else comes along with it as an obligation, it means that you're using wood to burn the item. Uketores nami de boy eitzim, now ketores also, the incense also requires wood, and so boy melech, so it actually would require salt according to that. Ulakamon nami amrinan, and later on also we're going to say barosho shel mizbeach shesham molchen haketoris v'hakometz. It says that at the top of the mizbeach, that's the place that they would salt the ketoris, the incense, and the kometz, which is again the fistful of the carbon mincha. And so again, the problem is we don't know who the author of this brisa is. It cannot be Rebbe, it cannot be the Rabbanan. And the Gemara continues and answers, Hai Tanahu, this brisa is following the Tana of Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. And the following brisa, the Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Omer, Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, says, Maha prat meforesh, just like that which is specified is davar shemekabel tumah, it's something that is mekabel tumah, means to say that carbon mincha, which is specified in the pasuk as requiring melach, that is something which is mekabel tumah. V'ola li'ishim, also it's burned with fire, it's offered with fire, it ascends with fire. V'yeshno al mizbeach hachitzon, and it is something that takes place on the outer mizbeach, that's where the carbon mincha is offered. Af kol davar ha-mekabel tumah v'ola li'ishim v'yeshno al mizbeach hachitzon, so too, anything that is mekabel tumah, anything that ascends through fire, and anything that is on the outer mizbeach, those things require melach. And so according to Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, what does that exclude? Yotzu eitzim shein mekabel tumah, that excludes wood, because wood is not mekabel tumah. The only things that are mekabel tumah are food or kalim, vessels. And yotzu dam v'yayin, that also excludes blood and wine. Shein olam li'ishim, those are not, they don't ascend through fire, they're poured on the mizbeach or applied to the mizbeach. And finally, yotza ketores, that also comes to exclude the ketores, the incense. Shein al mizbeach hachitzon, because the incense, that's not offered on the outer mizbeach, that is offered on the inner mizbeach. And so you see that there is this shita, this opinion, that the ketores does not require melach, it does not require salting. And Rashi explains haprat, that which is specified in the pasuk min chasecha, that's the pasuk that says your carbon mincha. Eitzim ein mekabel tumah, wood is not mekabel tumah. Rashi notes v'afagav the atze ma'arocha mekabel tumah. Now, even though the wood of the ma'arocha, which is the wood on the mizbeach, actually is mekabel tumah. Kedamrinim perak sheni de psachim, that we say in the second parak of psachim. V'habasar l'rabos eitzim u'levona. It's included from the word v'habasar in the pasuk. But hahimi d'rabbanan, who Rashi says that's actually only mekabel makabel tuma on a derabanan level, mishum chibas hakodesh, because of the fact that hektish is beloved. Ukra asmachta bialma, the pasuk that's being brought there is just a support. It's not really a doraisa. Da'etzem bialma lo makabel tuma. In general, wood is not makabel tuma. And the Gemara continues and asks, Ela taima demiyate kraladam, but the only reason why blood does not have melach, doesn't have a requirement of salt, is because of the fact that, again, we have an exclusion in the pasuk, as we said earlier, but that would imply halav hachi, if not for that, hava mina dam liboy melach. Apparently one would have said that blood, in fact, does require salting. But there's a problem with that fundamentally, the Gemara asks. Kevon demolche, once the blood is salted, nafik le mitoras dam, doesn't it leave the category of blood, and so therefore it would never be able to be applied after it's salted? And where do we see that? The Yamar Zeiri, Yamar Rabbi Chanina, because Zeiri said, that Rabbi Chanina said, Dam shebishlo, when blood is cooked, eino over olav, there is no transgression when the blood is cooked. That's talking about the transgression of consuming blood. It doesn't apply if the blood is cooked. For Rabbi Yehuda Amar Zeiri, and Rabbi Yehuda says that Zeiri says, Dam shemolchu, when blood is salted, eino over olav, there's no transgression of consuming the blood, meaning to say it's not in the category of blood anymore. Rav Yehuda Didei Amar, and Rav Yehuda himself says, a vorim shetzalon, when limbs are roasted vehelon and then offered up on the mizbeach, ein bohem mishum l'reach nichoach. That's not called reach nichoach. It doesn't have a pleasant aroma. And so again, the question of the Gemara is, we don't need a pasuk to exclude blood. It should be automatically excluded because when it's salted, it's no longer in the category of blood. And the Gemara continues and answers, Ma'u detema, what might you have said? Mishda ba mashu lemitzvah bi'alma. Maybe you just add a tiny amount of salt just for the mitzvah, and that would not take it out of the category of dam. That's what one might have thought without a pasuk. So kamash malon, the pasuk comes to teach us again that blood is excluded. And Rashi explains, dam shebishlo, that's blood that's cooked, bein dechulin bein dekadshim. This is talking about whether the blood is holy or not holy. Va'achalo, the point is we're talking about, again, the prohibition of consuming blood, so one eats it. Eino over olav, there is no transgression if it was cooked blood. Torah ella al hadam haroy lekapara, because the general rule is the Torah only obligates, one is only liable when it's blood that is fit to be used for atonement. V'dam kodshim misha bishlo, and when it comes to the blood of kodshim, once that's cooked, lo chazi lemilse, it is no longer fit for that atonement. V'nafik mitoras dam, it leaves the category of blood. And Rashi notes, umaliach hareu karoseach, and once it's salted, that's like it's boiled. That's the same thing as being cooked. Again, it leaves that category of dam. And Rashi continues, Ma'u detema mishta ba mashu lemitzvah bi'alma. What might you have said? A little should be thrown in just for the mitzvah. Umishamahu mashu lo nafik mitoras dam, and because of that small amount, it wouldn't necessarily leave the category of blood, and that's why we need a pasuk specifically to exclude it. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Gufa, returning to what we said above. Amar Zeiri, Amar Reb Chanina. Zeiri said that Reb Chanina said, Dam shebishlo, eino over olav. Again, if the blood is cooked, so there's no transgression of consuming the blood. Yosef Rava v'ka'amar lo lahashmaita. Rava was sitting and he was saying over this teaching again, that Dam shebishlo, there's no transgression. Eisvei Abaya. Abaya asked a question on Rava from the following brisa. Hikve es hadama v'acholo. Let's say the blood is congealed and he eats it congealed. O shehimche es hacholav, es hachelev rather v'gomor. Let's say he melts the chelev and then he swallows it, essentially drinks it. So chayiv, in these cases, the individual is liable. The brisa says that there is a liability in these cases. And so that would imply if hikve es hadam, if the blood congealed, there's still a liability of consuming the blood. Shouldn't that be the same when it comes to dam shebishlo, dam that is cooked? And the Gemara continues and answers, Lo kasha, it's not difficult. Kan shehikva ba'or. In a case where it was congealed, it was hardened through fire, that's dam shebishlo, so there is no liability. But kan shehikva b'chama. But in a situation where, let's say, it just congealed through the sun, so in that situation, we actually say that it is in the category of blood, and if one eats it, there is liability. And Rashi explains that if it's hikve ba'or v'achalo chayev misham damo chelev, again, then if the person eats it, then we say chayev, whether we're talking about the blood or the chelev. But bechama, but if it happens in the sun, hadra l'kamos shahayat slula l'kach chayev, there already it will be able to return to its original form. That blood will return to its original form, and therefore there is a liability in that case. As the Gemara continues and explains, Ba'or lo hadar, in fire, so will not return to its original state, therefore it leaves the category of dam, it leaves the category of blood, but bechama, but if it's in the sun, hadar, it will return to its original state, and therefore it is still in the category of dam. And the Gemara continues, but bechama, but even if it's in the sun, bechama nami, also in the sun, lema hoel v'idchi idchi. Why don't we say once it's pushed off, right now it is not in the category of blood, so it's pushed off. Maybe the fact that it returns to its original state at some point doesn't make a difference. And we see that that is the case to Haboy Minei Rabbi Moni mi Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Moni asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question: Dam shekarash v'acholo. Again, if you have dam that congeals and then one eats it, mahu, what's the halach in that case? Amar Lei said to him, hoel v'nidcha yidcha. Once it gets pushed off, it gets pushed off. You see, there's this concept of getting pushed off, and the Gemara says ishtik. The Gemara says he's silent. He did not know how to answer that question. But the Gemara continues, Amar Lei, he said to him, even though Rava was silent and couldn't answer the question of Abaya, Abaya said to Rava, maybe we can suggest the following answer. Dilma vadai kan bechatos hachitzonos, kan bechatos hapnimios. Maybe we make a distinction between the outer carbon chatos and the inner carbon chatos. And Rashi explains, first, dam shekarash, again, we're talking about the blood that congealed. Kasal kadaitach, initially the Gemara thinks, va'afilo dechulin, we're talking about all dam shekarash, all blood that congeals, even if we're talking about blood that is of chulin. And again, the answer of the Gemara was, the question was, dam shekarash v'acholo, if it congeals and it's eaten, what's the halacha? And the response was, hoel v'nidcha yidcha, once it's pushed off, it's outside the category of blood, and therefore there is no liability. And now the Gemara is answering, Abaye is answering, maybe we make a distinction. Kan b'chatos hachitzonos, here we're talking about outer carbon chatos, meaning, hadukatani hikfes adam b'chama. When we learn that if the blood is congealed, if it's hardened using the sun, va'acholo chayev, and we said that in that case, if one eats it, chayev, v'hu adin l'shel chulin, and the same would be true. It's true by outer chatos, but also true by chulin. Let's say it's blood that's chulin, that's not kodesh. So there, hoel v'roi l'kapara b'kodshim, there, since it is fit, since that blood is fit to be used for atonement by kodshim, so there we say that there is a liability. V'hada amar ze'iri, but when ze'iri said eino over olav, when ze'iri said that there is no liability, maybe that's bechatos hapnimios. That's by the inner carbon chatos, kegon parim musirim hanisrafim, like the bulls and the he-goats that are burned. The time of mefarsh l'kamon, and as the Gemara goes on, it will explain the reason why the chatos hapnimios are different. And we should note over here that according to Rashi's approach, when the Gemara here is offering the answer of a distinction between chatos hachitzonios and chatos hapnimios, the Gemara is still keeping the answer, keeping the distinction of hikve bechama and hikve be'or. In other words, the Gemara is keeping the idea that if it is hikve be'or, so then that's dam shebishlo, that's blood that is cooked. There certainly there is no transgression. And again, when it's hikve bechama, since it's going to revert to its old state, so there's a possibility of liability, but that's only going to be by chatos hachitzonios, and that's not going to be true by the chatos hapnimios, as the Gemara now goes on and explains. Omar, so Rava said to this, when he heard this distinction, he said, Ad karton milsa diamar Rav Chisda, you've reminded me of something that Rav Chisda said, dam shekarash, that when it comes to the blood that congeals, bechatos, by the chatos, v'achol, when it's eaten, chayiv, then there is a liability. That's talking about by the chatos hachitzonios. And why is there liability? V'lokach v'nosan amar achmona, because there, by the application of the blood by the outer chatos, it says he takes and he applies the blood. V'hai bar l'kichu nesinahu, and by congealed blood, that also is bar l'kichu nesina, that can be taken and applied. However, the difference is by chatos hapnimios, when it comes to the inner carbon chatos, v'acholo, over there, if the blood congealed and he ate it, potter, then he's actually exempt. Why? V'taval v'hizamar achmona, because by the applications of the blood by the chatos hapnimios, it says that he dips his finger and he sprinkles the blood. You can't dip your finger in congealed blood. V'hai lav bar tevila v'hazohu, this kind of blood you're not able to dip and to sprinkle, and so therefore specifically by the chatos hapnimios, there is no liability, and that's the distinction between those kinds of karbanos. And the Gemara continues, v'rava didei amar, and Rav himself actually says, afilu b'chatos hapnimios, even by the inner chatos, by the congealed blood, v'acholo, if the person eats it, chayev, he is chayev, and the reason for that is hoelu chenegdo roy b'chatos hachitzonos, since that kind of blood would be fit by something, by the outer carbon chatos, that's enough to create liability. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar Papa says, Hilkach, therefore, dam chamor shekarash, even the blood of a donkey, which a donkey is not offered as a carbon, but still, the blood of a donkey that congeals, v'acholo, and it's eaten chayev, one is liable, because again, you apply the logic of kenegdo, hoelu chenegdo roy, b'chatos hachitzonos, since the corresponding kind of blood could be used by the outer chatos, that is enough to put it in the category of dam, and there is liability. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Gidl, Amar Zeiri. Rav Gidl says that Zeiri says dam when it comes to blood, bein lach, bein yavish, whether it's moist or whether it's dry, chotzetz, it would be a chatzitza in terms of immersion in a mikvah. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question on this from the following brayso, hadom, v'hadiyov, v'hadvash, v'hacholav. When it comes to blood, ink, honey, or milk, yavesh and chotzetzin, if they're dry, then they're a chatzitza, then they're a separation in terms, again, of immersion in a mikvah, but lachen, but if they're moist, ein an chotzetzin, so then they're not a chatzitza. That goes against what Zeiri said, that dam, it doesn't matter if it's lach or yavesh. And the Gemara continues and answers, lokash, it's not difficult, had sarich, had lo sarich. In one case, we're talking where it is lach, but it is sticky, and so therefore that already would be a chatzitza, but if it's not sticky, if it's just liquid, so then we would say that it is not a chatzitza. And Rashi explains, Hilkach, therefore, the Amrit Amrin on Hoel, since we say this logic of Hoel Uchenegdo Roy, since theoretically, in a corresponding case, it would be fit to be used by the Chatos HaChitzonios, so then Dam Chamor, the blood of a donkey, Afapi Sheino Roy LaCarbon, even though the blood of a donkey and a donkey itself is not fit for a carbon, Vikol Meimar Delo Chayva Torah Kares El Al Dam Haroy LaCarbon, one could say that there's only liability to Kares by blood that is fit for a carbon, El Afilu Chamor De'ein Carbon B'Tmei and Afilu Hachichayev. Nevertheless, even by a donkey, there is no carbon by the tamei animals, but still, we say chayev, still we say liable. Chotzetz linyan tevila, again, in terms of immersion in a mikvah, it's a chatzitza, and the Gemara made a distinction between sarich, which means it's sticky, shemaschil is yabish, that means it began to dry, well, he dovik tzas, and it sticks a little, chotzetz, then it is a chatzitza, but lo sarich, if it's not sticky, shekishatolin bo etzba nimshach v'holech chut mimenu, that means if you put your finger and you can draw it because of the fact that it is liquidy, so then it is not going to be a chatzitza. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Again, the pasuk said, "V'chol karba min choscha b'melach timlach." It seems to be a double lashon, a double language. And so the Gemara asks, "Timlach l'may also? What is timlach coming to include?" And the Gemara says, "L'chidetanya." It's coming to include what is taught in the following brayso. The brayso says, "B'melach." It says in the pasuk, "B'melach," in salt. Yachol tivunehu. One might think tivunehu. The Gemara will discuss what exactly that term means. Talmud lomar timlach. The pasuk says timlach. Timlach. If it just said timlach, yachol b'mei melach, one might think in salt water. Talmud lomar b'melach, it says b'melach, it means in salt. And the pasuk says v'lo sash bis melach, it says v'lo sash bis melach, means that the salt, it should not rest, so to speak, from your offerings. And it means to say, have melach she'ena shoveses, you have to bring salt that doesn't rest. Ve'ezu zu melach stomis, and what does that refer to? That refers to what's called melach stomis. Rashi will discuss this. Uminayin shem lo motza melach stomis, and from where do we know that if one doesn't find the stone salt, shemevi melach isteroknis, that he can bring melach isteroknis? Talmud lomar takriv, it says in the pasuk takriv, and takriv kolshu, takriv mikol mokom, takriv means anything, takriv means in any case, and takriv vafilu b'Shabbos, takriv means even offered on Shabbos, the salt is offered even on Shabbos, and takriv vafilu b'tumah, and takriv means even b'tumah, even in impurity. And Rashi explains tivunehu mefarish lakamon. Again, the term tivunehu is going to be explained as the Gemara goes on. Mei melach is talking about salt water or moris or brine. She'ena shoveses, and then the Gemara said that we're talking about salt that's she'ena shoveses. Have melach she'ena shoveses, which is melach stomis. Rashi explains what is ena shoveses. It doesn't rest. Shemitzuya bekayetz uvechoref. What that means is that salt can be found in the summer and in the winter seasons. Umelach stomis hayom mashlich la'agfa. When it comes to the salt of stone, the sea, it throws it out to its banks, and essentially it's produced naturally, it's found all the time. But isteroknis, when we talk about melach isteroknis, that is min hakarkanasis, that comes from the earth. That is something that has to be mined uvidei adam, it is mined by people, and that's why it's not considered to be mitsuya bekayitz uvechoref. And so the Brisa said again, how does one know that if one cannot find the melach stomis, that melach isteroknis is good? And that's because it says takriv, it says in the pasuk takriv, so that comes to include melach isteroknis as well. And then the Brisa said mikolshu, you bring it from anything. Again, that was the language of the Brisa. The language of the Brisa was that how do you know? It says takriv kolshu. Rashi says that line in the Brisa means bein stomis, bein isteroknis. That line is referring back to what the Brisa just said, that you can bring whether melach stomis or whether melach isteroknis. And then it said takriv means mikol makom. That means vafilo michutz laaretz. Rashi says that literally means from any place, meaning even Chutz La'aretz, even outside Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi also notes Sedomis Daka, that Melach Stomis is the finer kind of salt, and Istoroknes Gasa, Istoroknes is coarser, it's larger kind of salt. And finally, again, the Brisa said that Takriv is Va'afilu b'Shabbos, even on Shabbos, it should be salted, and Takriv Va'afilu b'Tumah, even b'Tumah, meaning just like Karbonos in general can be permitted in certain situations, b'Tumah, so too the salting is also permitted in those situations. And the Gemara continues and asks, Mai Tivuneu, what's the meaning of the Brisa when it said Tivuneu? It said one might think Tivuneu, Talmud Lomar Timlach. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rabba Bar Ula says, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Brisa is saying. Yachol Yisbonenu Ketevin Betit. One might think that a lot of salt should be used, like we find by straw, that straw is used together when mixing straw with clay. Rashi explains, Yachol Yisbonenu Yitein Melach Harbe. One might think to use a lot of salt, Ketevin Betit, again, like straw with clay, one might think that, and so the Brisa is saying that it doesn't have to be a lot of salt. But the Gemara continues and asks, Amar Le Abaya said to him, to Rabba Bar Ula, if so, Yisbonenu mi boile, the term is not being used properly, it shouldn't say Tivoneu, it should say Yisbonenu. El Amar Abaya, rather Abaya says, what does it mean Tivoneu? Yachol Yasenu Kibinyan, it means one might think that one should make it like a building. And Rashi explains Kibinyan like something that's being built, meaning Melach Harbe, again, it means the same idea, a lot of salt, Shura al Shura, one row on top of another row of salt, that's what the Brisa means. And again, the Brisa is saying it doesn't have to be so much. But Amar Le Rava said to him, Ihachi Yivnenu mi boile, again, still it's the wrong term, it should have said Yivnenu. El Amar Rava, rather Rava says, the way to understand the Brisa is, Yachol Tivunehu, and the simple understanding is that Rava means to say Tivunehu instead of Tivonehu. And my Tivunehu, what does Tivunehu mean? Amar Ravashi says, Yachol Yitein Botam Kibina. One might think that just a small taste of salt should be applied, Kibina like understanding. Rashi explains, No senes tam Kibina ba'adam, like understanding in a person, just a small amount. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says Timlach, it says Timlach, and it actually means a larger amount. And Ketzad Huosa, what does he do? Mevi ha'aver, he brings the limb, v'nosin olav melach, he puts salt on it, v'chozer v'hofchu, and then he turns it over, v'nosin olav melach, and puts salt on it again, u'ma'alei, when he offers it up in that fashion. And Amar Abaya says, v'chein l'kadeira, the same is true by a pot. And Abaya means to say that the same salting process is used when preparing food that's going to be cooked. They would have to salt the meat in order to extract, in order to take out the blood. So the same salting process, the same procedure should be used over there when preparing meat as food. And Rashi explains, Takrif b'Shabbos u'v'tumah. This is going back on the Brisa that said you offer it b'Shabbos and b'tumah im karban sibaru. That means if it's a communal karban. V'ashmeinan demilichasan avodahi. The point of the Brisa is the salting also is part of the avoda. Shabbos v'tumah kashar avoda. So it pushes off Shabbos and tumah just like any other avoda, just like any other service of a karban. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis.